Good evening, my bloodthirsty brood. Tonight I've unearthed a tale that will have you gasping for air, or should I say, blood. It's the story of a girl who thought her biggest teenage problem was curfew, until she discovered the real battle was with her own dark desires. But when the moon rises and the shadows close in, she's about to learn that her thirst isn't her only predator lurking in the darkness. So clutch your crucifixes and sharpen your stakes, because this one's dripping with suspense, terror, and just a dash of hemoglobin horror. Sink your fangs into tonight's chilling tale, The Vampire's Child.
Blood doesn't scream, it whispers, weaving itself into your thoughts like a haunting memory. It's persistent, subtle, like shadows stretching unnoticed until it's too late. The first time I felt it, I was 10. The night wrapped itself around me like an omen as I stood beneath the harsh glow of a street lamp, clutching my mother's hand. Her voice was low but firm as she whispered the rules of the night, warnings about what to avoid, where to look, and what never to say. Back then, none of it made sense. Now, those rules have twisted into truths far darker than I ever could have imagined. I'm Lila, or at least I think I am. Names lose their meaning when you can't remember the last time you truly lived. Most teenagers worry about curfews, grades, fitting in. I worry about hunger, a hunger that claws deeper than anything I can explain. I live in a town that doesn't care, shadow-drenched and forgotten, caught between years like a photograph left in the dark. Days bleed together, and nights stretch on, as if time itself refuses to move. There's no escape, not for people like me. A vampire, if you want to put it simply. But training is a fragile word, one that no longer feels like it fits the reality of what I've become. Time doesn't just pass here. It traps you, suffocating you long enough to forget who you were and who you might still become. My mother is a living legend, a centuries-old vampire whose grace can silence a room, whose eyes have witnessed the rise and fall of empires. When she looks at me, I feel the weight of her gaze like a mountain pressing down on my chest, coupled with the haunting knowledge that I'll never be worthy of it. She calls me her Child of Twilight, a title I once thought poetic, a reflection of my nature, caught between light and darkness. But as I grow older, I realize it's more of a curse than a blessing. I stand on the edge of two worlds, one fragile, bathed in daylight, where I search for whatever innocence I can still grasp, and the other a darker world I am being groomed for, where there is no redemption. The truth is, I'm not sure where I belong, and lately I've begun to suspect that my mother isn't sure either. Life used to be simple, at least that's what I tell myself now, before everything started to unravel. Homeschooling by candlelight, the flickering shadows hiding my mistakes. I used to sneak out only when the world was asleep, under the heavy cloak of night, when the only sounds were the wind and the quiet pulse of hunger. I practiced feeding on animals, staging each drill like a cruel rehearsal, learning control as if it were an instinct I had to fake. It was all a ritual, a facade I wore to fit the mold she'd crafted for me. But last week something shifted. I felt it. The air changed, thick with the weight of something I couldn't name, and I knew in that moment everything had cracked. Time has a way of obscuring the moment when things truly change, but I can feel it now, the fracture, the break in what I thought was reality. And with it came a question I wasn't ready to face. What if everything I've ever known, everything I've been told, has been nothing but a lie? It wasn't just the whispers of blood anymore. It became a roar, a primal, unrelenting force that rattled my bones, a hunger that didn't care about permission or restraint. It tore at me, ripping through the fragile walls I'd carefully built to protect whatever humanity still clung to me, walls that told me I was still someone, still human in some twisted way. The longer I resisted, the louder it became, until it felt like the hunger was swallowing me whole, drowning out everything I thought I knew about myself. And with that roar, my carefully constructed world began to splinter. Not just the routines and safety, but the very truth I had been living. Time started folding in on itself, unraveling, revealing that the rules I'd followed, the life I thought I knew, were never mine. And in that moment, I realized, too late, that I had been living someone else's story all along. The night it all began, I found myself in the woods, just outside of town. My mother called it a test of control, the final lesson before I could fully step into the world she had been preparing me for. But to me it felt like a punishment, one I couldn't escape, like a chain wrapped tight around my chest. The rules were simple: track the scent, find the source, and stop before I fed. Simple, as if following them would prove I was ready. But nothing is ever simple in the dark, and the darkness always hides something the rules can't account for. And then there was him, the boy. He appeared without warning, an anomaly among the trees, his scent a feast to a starving wolf. I shouldn't have been surprised. I had been trained for moments like this, but nothing had prepared me for how he would shift everything. Our eyes met, and time itself seemed to freeze. It was as if the world had become a hinge, suspended between two moments, before and after. A single heartbeat, and suddenly the rules didn't matter anymore. At first, I hadn't noticed him. He sat by the creek, absorbed in his sketchpad, his presence slipping by unnoticed, as if he were part of the night itself. The water's soft murmur masked his heartbeat, the rhythmic pulse that once would have alerted me. But then, the breeze shifted, and his scent slammed into me, overpowering, like a wave crashing against something too fragile to withstand it. Warm, rich, intoxicating. It flooded my senses, a temptation so strong I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. My hunger surged, raw and primal, washing over me like a tide. It consumed everything, my thoughts, my will, my very self. The world around me shrank, distorted by the pressure of it, the scent, the pulse, the essence of him pulling me in like a magnet. My mind screamed at me to run, to turn back, to follow the rules that had been drilled into me. But my feet, they betrayed me. They carried me forward, step after step, against every rational instinct I had left. It was like watching a clock tick backward, each second stretching longer than the last, until time itself seemed to warp, both inevitable and beyond my control. His eyes met mine, wide and startled, like he could see right through me, through the hunger, through the carefully constructed facade I'd been holding up. "Hey, are you okay?" His voice was soft, but it hit me like a bomb, shaking me from the depths of hunger and pulling me violently back to reality. I hadn't been prepared for this. I hadn't been prepared for him. I froze. This wasn't part of the test. He wasn't part of the plan. My mind screamed at me to follow the rules, to do what I was supposed to do, but my body, it refused. The rules had been clear, or at least I thought they were. Find the source, control the hunger. But none of this had accounted for him. His presence was a glitch in the system, something I wasn't prepared for. And for the first time I wondered, really wondered, if I had ever been prepared for any of this at all. Had I been living a lie this whole time? Was the test really a test, or was it a trap? The moment stretched, fragmented, like I was trapped in a puzzle that didn't make sense. A single question began to pulse through me, relentless and suffocating. What if I wasn't meant to follow the plan at all? I didn't reply. I couldn't. The ache in my gums was unbearable, a gnawing pressure that pulsed with every beat of his heart, like a dark rhythm driving me forward. It wasn't just hunger anymore. It was an insatiable, animalistic drive that shattered every scrap of restraint I had left. My breath quickened, and I could feel the tension in my body tightening, like every muscle was being drawn taut by an invisible force. My eyes stayed locked on his, but I could feel my senses narrowing, focusing only on the beat of his heart, the pulse under his skin. The boy tilted his head, concern flickering across his features. "You're bleeding." His voice cut through the tension like a blade, too sharp, too calm for the storm raging inside me. I barely heard him over the roaring in my head, but his words landed like a strike. My gaze followed his finger to the crimson streak on my chin, and something inside me snapped. I hadn't realized. I hadn't even felt it. The tiny wound where my teeth had punctured my own lip in a desperate attempt to hold the hunger back. To him, it was a small, trivial thing, but to me, it felt like the first crack in the fragile wall I'd built around myself, a reminder that I was losing this battle. His gaze, full of innocent concern, seemed to mock me, or maybe it was my own mind unraveling, the weight of the moment distorting everything around me. This wasn't part of the plan. I wasn't supposed to feel this way. I wasn't supposed to lose control. Whispers of blood grew louder, each one building on the last until they merged into a cacophony. Shouts, shrieks, primal demands that rattled my soul. It was unbearable, a storm of noise that drowned everything else out. But just as I thought I might lose myself in it, the world around me began to shift. The ground trembled beneath me, a subtle but undeniable movement that rippled through the earth, disturbing the stillness. The branches above creaked and groaned in a rhythm that felt out of sync with the natural world, twisting and bending like limbs that weren't quite sure where they belonged. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, elongating as if they had a mind of their own, reaching for me, pulling me deeper into something I couldn't see. The air grew colder, thicker, pressing down on me like a vice, suffocating me with an ancient presence that I couldn't escape. It wasn't just my hunger anymore. There was something else here, something dark, ancient, and watching. The sensation of being watched crawled under my skin, tightening like an invisible grip, suffocating me from all sides. It wasn't the familiar, quiet observer I'd been trained to sense. This was something else, something that wasn't supposed to be real, and it was waiting. A sickening realization crawled up my spine. I wasn't alone, and I wasn't in control. Time fractured again, stretched like an elastic band, snapping between the two realities. I felt myself being pulled between them, one where I knew the rules, and the other where the world around me was bending and breaking, reshaping into something I couldn't understand. The rustling in the bushes snapped me out of my trance, yanking me back into a reality that felt increasingly unstable. My heart pounded, each beat a sharp reminder of the danger closing in. The air felt thicker now, as though the very trees were pressing in on me, urging me to run before it was too late. And then, like a shadow slipping through the cracks of my mind, my mother's voice echoed in my thoughts. "You're not the only predator in these woods." Her words, always a lesson, always a command, had never felt so sharp, so full of foreboding. I'd always taken them at face value, a distant warning I could dismiss. But now they reverberated through me, a chilling reminder that the woods held far more danger than I had ever imagined. Something else was here, something that didn't belong. I swallowed hard, the knot in my throat a reflection of the dread seeping deeper into my bones. The world around me felt as if it was shifting, tilting just enough to make me question what was real and what was a trick of my mind. I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in, thick and suffocating. The rustling grew louder, closer. Whatever was hiding in the shadows was getting ready to reveal itself. And it wasn't waiting for my permission. I took a step back, my breath shallow, my hands trembling as they gripped the rough bark of a tree for support. The coldness of it barely registered. My mind was elsewhere, caught in the spiraling doubt that had begun to take root. Was this who I was destined to become? A creature of the night, driven by instincts I couldn't control. A monster who couldn't resist something as simple as a boy sitting by a creek? The question gnawed at me, unraveling everything I thought I knew about myself. My mother had always said hunger was something to control, to tame with discipline. But in that moment, it felt like a lie, or worse. What if it wasn't? What if I was nothing more than a monster in the making, one misstep away from losing myself completely? The taste of him, the proximity of his heart, beating in time with my own, made it hard to tell where I ended and where the hunger began. Was I even Lila anymore? Or had I already crossed a line, one invisible but definitive, one I couldn't uncross no matter how hard I tried? The moment felt like a breaking point. Every instinct screamed at me, drowning out the voice of reason. I wasn't sure if I could ever return from this place. Had I already lost myself? Had I crossed into something darker, something irreversible? The boy stood, his sketchpad slipping from his fingers and falling to the ground with a soft thud. "Are you lost?" he asked, his voice naive, unknowing of the storm brewing just beneath the surface of my skin. Lost. The word cut through me like a shard of ice, sharp and unrelenting. It wasn't just a question. It was the truth, the raw, painful truth that I had been avoiding. Lost in my hunger, lost in the blur between what I was and what I was becoming, lost in the fragments of my identity, slipping through my fingers like sand. The boy didn't know it, but his question had peeled away the last illusion of control I'd been clinging to, and perhaps that was the cruelest part of it all, the feeling that I had been lost long before this night, in this twilight that never ended, where day and night blurred together, leaving no clear horizon, no escape, a place where nothing felt certain, and every step I took seemed to take me farther from who I was meant to be. The longer I stood there, the more the darkness seemed to creep in, wrapping around me like a cold, suffocating fog. It wasn't just the hunger anymore. It was the weight of everything I could no longer hold on to. The boy stood there oblivious, but in that moment, his innocence felt like a distant memory of something I could never be again. I have to go," I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper, as if saying it aloud might make the weight of the words even heavier. But before I could move, a guttural growl pierced the air, a low, throaty sound that seemed to come from all around, vibrating through the very ground beneath my feet. It wasn't me, the realization hit with the force of a cold slap. My hunger was consuming, but this was something else, something far darker. The boy spun around, his body frozen in place for a moment, eyes wide with panic. "What was that?" he asked, his voice cracking, trembling with fear. I didn't answer him. I couldn't. The words caught in my throat, twisted by the knot of fear that had nothing to do with the hunger inside me. My hands shook, and my breath quickened as I tried to make sense of what was happening, but the growl was enough to tell me. Something was wrong, something far worse than I had ever been prepared for. The shadows that had once seemed so distant now felt close, intentional. A predator was stalking us, and this time I knew. It wasn't me. The air had thickened. the very fabric of the night pressing in around us, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. It wasn't just my thirst anymore. It was something far worse. Something that didn't care about hunger, about control, about anything I had ever been trained to fight. This was a predator, pure and unrestrained, lurking just beyond the edges of my perception, and the terrifying thought crept in. What if I wasn't the only one who had been changed by the night? What if I, too, had become a part of this darker world? A world where the line between predator and prey was as thin and fragile as a single breath. The forest had become something else, a living entity, its branches stretching toward us like the fingers of a great beast. The night air had grown thick with tension, almost suffocating. It felt as though the trees were whispering, their creaks and groans not from the wind, but from something else, something darker. The boy's eyes flicked around, his body tense, but I could see the confusion in him. He didn't understand what I felt, the pressure in the air, the way the world seemed to hum with the promise of something dangerous. His fear was real, but it was the fear of something he couldn't see, something he couldn't comprehend. But mine was the fear of knowing exactly what was out there, and not knowing if I could stop it. The growl came again, deeper, closer this time, reverberating through the trees like a warning from the heart of the night itself. Then, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, crunched through the underbrush, drawing nearer with each passing second. The air grew colder, the silence between each step stretching out like an eternity. The boy's panic deepened, his breath shallow, his eyes wide with terror. "What's out there?" he asked, his voice trembling, barely a whisper over the growing sounds of movement. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My body was already moving, instincts overriding my thoughts. The terror in his voice rang in my ears, but it was drowned out by the roar of my hunger, by the primal urge to protect, to survive, to fight. The boy was a liability now, an anchor that threatened to drag me down, to pull me back to the human side of myself. But the hunger wasn't the only thing I had to fight. The shadows thickened, and I could see the outline of something, massive, dark, and twisted, its form indistinct yet unmistakable, like the night itself had taken shape. It moved with an unsettling grace, shifting between trees as though it were part of the forest, a living extension of the darkness. Every step the predator took brought it closer, the heavy crunch of the underbrush like a countdown to something inevitable. I could feel the weight of its presence, the suffocating pressure of the air, as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for the moment when it would finally strike. The boy was breathing in frantic gasps beside me, but I couldn't afford to hear him anymore. My instincts were in control now, and there was only one question. Could I escape this night without losing everything? I couldn't tell him. I couldn't afford to. Not without giving myself away, not without revealing the darkness that clawed at the edges of my humanity. The words caught in my throat, choked by the weight of the truth I couldn't let him hear. I tried to step in front of him, to shield him, but my body refused to obey. It was as if I were rooted to the ground, trapped between the pull of my instincts and the need to protect. My senses were flooded, overwhelmed by the scent of the night, the sharp tang of fear in the boy's breath, the thundering beat of his heart, but louder than all of it was the roar of my own blood, screaming for release. The hunger surged, hot and violent, pulling at me, twisting me into something I didn't recognize. I could feel my body trembling, the unnatural pull of the hunt taking over, drowning everything else. And then I saw it, a figure, tall and impossibly still, emerging from the darkness like a shadow made flesh. It was cloaked in the blackness of the night, the very air around it warping with its presence. Its eyes gleamed, a terrifying blood-red glow that burned hotter than the moon above, as if they were alive with an ancient hunger of their own. It wasn't just the red glow of its eyes, burning like molten embers. It was the sheer weight of its presence, like the forest itself had bent under its power. Its body, taller than any human form, seemed to absorb the moonlight, turning the night into a cloak of malice. The air crackled, with a kind of energy that made the ground beneath my feet feel unstable, as if the creature itself could tear reality apart with a single movement. It wasn't human. It was something far worse, something older, something that made my hunger seem like a whisper in comparison, a creature born of the night, with a power that radiated from every inch of its form, and I was not sure if I was more afraid of it, or of what I was becoming in its presence. I knew this creature. I had seen its kind only in stories, warnings whispered in the dark corners of our world. It was a hunter, one of us, but far older, far stronger. Its presence was a palpable weight in the air, a force that made the very trees around us seem to cower in fear. My mother had warned me about the ancient vampires who roamed the edges of our world, preying on the unwary, feeding without restraint, existing beyond the laws that governed us. They were predators, yes, but also something worse. A forgotten primal terror that had no regard for the rules, the boundaries we lived by. The figure stepped forward, the darkness parted around it, bending to its will. With each movement, the air seemed to crackle with a dark energy, a power that filled the space between us and turned my own hunger into something small and insignificant in comparison. It stared at me, its eyes locking with mine. Recognition flickered in its gaze, and I felt a chill run through me. It wasn't just looking at me, it was seeing me, all the way down to the bone. You've wandered too far, child. Too far from the rules, too far from safety, it rasped, its voice low and dripping with malice. The words hit me like a physical blow, a judgment, a verdict. My knees buckled as if the weight of its presence was forcing me down, my heart pounding a desperate rhythm. But it wasn't the boy I was worried about anymore. The presence of this creature, this thing, made my existence feel like a flickering candle in a storm, fragile, fleeting, and utterly insignificant. The boy screamed, his voice high and frantic, backing away in terror, but I couldn't move. My body was locked in place, frozen, not by fear for myself, not by fear for him, but by something far worse, a cold realization that gripped my chest like a vice. The creature didn't want us both. It didn't care about me anymore. It wanted him. The predator's smile twisted, its lips stretching unnaturally wide, sharp fangs gleaming in the moonlight. "You've brought me a feast," it purred, the words dripping with sickening satisfaction. Its eyes never left the boy, the hunger in them growing palpable, feeding off his fear, feeding off my helplessness. I shook my head in disbelief, my voice barely a whisper, hoarse and cracked. "No." The word felt foreign in my mouth, a desperate plea that meant nothing in the face of this creature's power. The last thing I wanted was for the boy to become part of this world, my world, the world of darkness, hunger, and predators. I wanted him to be safe, to remain untouched by this curse I had been born into. But in that moment, the bitter truth hit me harder than any blow. I wasn't in control, not anymore. This wasn't just a test. It was a game, and I was the prey. The ancient vampire lunged for the boy, its fangs bared, its hunger so palpable it seemed to bleed into the very air. But before it could strike, I moved. It wasn't a thought. It wasn't a choice. It was instinct, pure and unrestrained, born from the same hunger that had plagued me all night. In a flash, the hunger inside me exploded, flooding my veins with a power I had never known I could wield. It roared to life, brutal and uncontrollable, drowning every trace of hesitation. I wasn't sure if I was saving him or sealing his fate, but I acted. My body surged forward, my fist slamming into the vampire's chest with a force that shook the very earth beneath us. The creature staggered back, its eyes narrowing in disbelief, but it didn't fall. It was stronger than I'd anticipated, older, a force that seemed impervious to the raw power that coursed through me. I felt a surge of dread. Had I done enough? Had I done anything at all? For a moment, everything hung in the balance, a fragile thread between the life of the boy and the horror that was unfolding. The hunger gnawed at me, clawing from within, and I realized with a chilling clarity that I had just crossed a line. I wasn't just trying to protect him anymore. I was fighting for control, not only of the situation, but of myself. In the chaos, I looked at the boy. His chest heaved with each ragged breath, his eyes wide and brimming with terror. But there was something else in his gaze, a flicker of something deeper, sharper, recognition. He wasn't afraid of me. He was afraid of something far worse. The ancient vampire snarled, a guttural sound that rattled through the clearing like the growl of a storm. Its crimson eyes burned into me. Its lips curled in a twisted smirk as it wiped the blood from its mouth. The faint smear of crimson on its hand made my stomach twist. It wasn't mine. It wasn't the boy's either. "You think you've saved him?" the creature spat, its voice laced with mockery and something that felt like an amusement. "Foolish child, you don't know what you've just unleashed." The weight of its words pressed down on me, heavier than the night itself. Before I could respond, before I could demand answers, the vampire melted into the shadows, its form dissipating as if it had never been there at all. One moment, it was a looming threat. The next, it was gone. The silence that followed was deafening, thick with questions I couldn't begin to answer. The forest seemed to hold its breath, every shadow stretching out as if the darkness itself was watching us. My legs felt like lead, and the hunger still simmered in my veins, unfulfilled and relentless. I turned to the boy. His face was pale, but his eyes, those wide, unblinking eyes, told a story I couldn't yet piece together. He didn't look at me with fear, not like he should have. Instead, he looked past me, into the void where the creature had stood, his lips trembling as if to form words he couldn't quite say. "Who are you?" I whispered, though I wasn't sure if the question was for him or myself. I couldn't breathe. Each gasp of air felt thin, cold, as though the night itself had turned against me. The shadows around us seemed heavier now, thicker, pressing in like a suffocating tide. My heart thundered in my chest, but it wasn't enough to drown out the lingering echo of the vampire's parting words. "You don't know what you've unleashed." The boy stood motionless, his silence louder than the roar of my own fear. His wide eyes no longer carried confusion or even terror. What stared back at me was something darker, something far more unnerving. Recognition had given way to understanding. I wanted to run, to flee from the weight of what had just happened, to escape this suffocating forest and the suffocating hunger that still churned within me. But my feet felt cemented to the earth, held fast by more than fear. The vampire was gone. Its monstrous presence dissipated into the shadows, but the air still buzzed with its memory, its malice. The boy's gaze pinned me, sharp and probing, and for a fleeting moment I wondered if he could see through me. Past the thin veil of humanity I clung to, straight into the predator lurking underneath. I didn't mean, I started, my voice cracking. But he shook his head, a small, almost imperceptible motion cutting me off. "It's not your fault," he said, his voice low, calm, too calm. It sent a chill down my spine, far colder than the night air. I stared at him, my mind reeling. Not my fault? He didn't run. He didn't scream. He just stood there, the weight of his presence growing, an unnatural steadiness that felt out of place, out of time. What? My throat tightened around the question I was too afraid to finish. What had I done? What had I saved? Or worse, what had I unleashed? The boy bent down, picking up his fallen sketchpad with hands that didn't tremble. When he stood again, he looked at me with an expression I couldn't read, as though he was waiting for something. For me. "Thank you," he said finally. But the words felt wrong, hollow, as if they were meant for someone else. I took a step back, my legs shaking beneath me, and then another. The boy didn't move to follow. He just stood there, framed by the thick, oppressive dark, watching as I stumbled into the shadows. The boy took a hesitant step toward me, his footfall crunching softly against the forest floor. Each movement was deliberate, his arms slightly outstretched as though bracing himself for something to lash out. His voice, barely more than a whisper, wavered through the oppressive silence. What was that? The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. My lips parted, but no words came. What could I say? That the thing in the woods was an ancient predator? That it was the same kind of creature I was destined to become? The hunger coiled in my chest like a living thing, sharp and relentless. It wasn't just the fight, it was the temptation, the near surrender to a craving that felt as vast and ancient as the darkness itself. My body trembled, not from exhaustion, but from the crushing weight of knowing how close I had come to losing myself. I took a step back, willing the distance to shield him from my truth. But then his eyes shifted, the raw fear in them cooling into something I couldn't decipher. Understanding flickered in his gaze, fleeting yet unmistakable, as though he could see past the cracks in the mask I clung to, catching a glimpse of the shadowed truth beneath. "You're not like other people, are you?" he asked, his voice steady now, cutting through the fragile quiet like a blade. The question landed like a blow, knocking the breath from my lungs. I swallowed hard, feeling the sharp edge of my fangs graze against my tongue. The hunger snarled, restless and unsatisfied, clawing to surface. But I forced it down, though I wasn't sure if I was keeping it at bay for his sake, or mine. "No," I said finally, the word trembling under the weight of what it meant. "I'm not." The words hung in the air, fragile but unbreakable, like a thread binding our two fractured worlds. His expression didn't shift, no fear, no revulsion. Instead, he studied me, his head tilting as though searching for answers to a question he hadn't realized he'd been asking all along. The boy's voice wavered, fragile like glass on the verge of breaking, but beneath it was something unshakable, a quiet strength that defied the fear in his wide eyes. "I don't know what that thing was," he said, his gaze steady, "but I'll stay with you." His words sliced through the chaos within me, leaving a quiet ache in their wake. Acceptance. I hadn't realized how much I craved it, how dangerous it was to want something so fleeting, so fragile. For a moment, the cold weight of the night seemed to lift, the gnawing hunger inside me quieting to a dull roar. My heart raced, not with fear, but with something far more treacherous, hope. But I knew better. The night was more than my prison. It was my identity, a cloak of shadows I couldn't shed. The hunger wasn't a weakness I could conquer. It was my compass, guiding every step I took, every choice I made. I tore my gaze from his, staring into the endless black of the forest. "You don't understand," I whispered, my voice trembling under the weight of my confession. It's not something you can just stay with. I'm not someone you can stay with." The boy didn't move. He didn't speak, but his presence was unyielding, solid as stone, as though he were bracing himself to bear the weight of my words, even if he couldn't comprehend their meaning. "No matter how much I try to resist," I said, my voice cracking, "it always calls me back. The hunger. It's who I am." I forced myself to look at him then, to face whatever response he would give. What I found wasn't fear or pity. It was determination, quiet and unwavering, as though he'd already decided what I was and that it didn't scare him. "Then I'll help you fight it," he said simply, his words anchoring me even as they tore me apart. For the first time, the weight of the night didn't feel so crushing, but the relief was fleeting, a fragile hope that I knew couldn't last, because hope and hunger couldn't coexist, and no matter how much I wanted to believe him, the shadows within me were patient. They would wait, and they would win. As I turned to leave, the soft crunch of leaves behind me broke the silence. The boy was following, his footsteps light but steady, a quiet determination in every step. He didn't speak, didn't question me, as though he understood that words would only shatter the fragile stillness between us. He didn't understand what he was getting himself into. How could he? And yet for now his presence was enough. The woods whispered with unseen movement, each rustle of leaves a reminder that we weren't alone. The air carried a damp chill, heavy with the scent of earth and decay, as though the forest itself was breathing around us. The light of the moon, once sharp and silver, faded into the canopy above, swallowed by the weight of the night. We walked in silence, two fragile beings navigating a world that would devour us both if it could. With every step, the hunger inside me simmered, a storm clawing at the edges of my sanity. It wasn't just thirst, it was something more insidious, a relentless pull that threatened to consume what little control I had left. Each breath felt like a battle, each step a defiance against the creature stirring inside me. I clenched my fists, the tension grounding me, even as my mind whispered how easy it would be to give in. But the boy's steady presence drew me forward, his quiet resolve a stark contrast to the chaos within me. He followed without hesitation, his steps unwavering, as if he didn't fear the dark but embraced it. There was a strength in his calmness, a defiance I couldn't understand, but couldn't ignore. The real battle wasn't just for survival. It wasn't about outlasting the predators lurking in the shadows or evading the ancient creatures that hunted without remorse. It was for my soul. Piece by piece it was slipping through my grasp, each surrender to the hunger chipping away at what little humanity I still clung to. How much longer could I hold on before the night claimed me entirely? The boy glanced at me briefly, his expression unreadable, before his gaze shifted back to the path ahead. For now he trusted me to lead, even if I didn't trust myself. And in that unspoken bond I found a flicker of something I thought I'd lost. Purpose. For now there was only one thing left to do. Keep walking, into the night, into the shadows, into a darkness that neither of us truly understood, but one that I feared would claim me before long.
Well, my creepy comrades, wasn't that a bloody good time? Poor little Lila, caught between the light and dark, craving answers, and a midnight snack. But hey, they say you can't pick your family, or your blood type. So, what did we learn tonight, kiddies? That growing up can really suck, especially when you're living on the bite side of life. If you thirst for more tales of terror, why not stake your claim and subscribe? Give this story a thumbs up if you think it's fantastic, and drop a comment below before Lila does, because trust me, you don't want her feeding on you. Until next time, keep your necks covered and your secrets buried, because you never know when the shadows are watching.